May 8th, 2008, Culiacan, Sinaloa, the most protected city in all of Mexico, a fortress built around one man's name, El Chapo Guzmán. His son, 22-year-old Édgar Guzmán López, was standing in a supermarket parking lot that night. Not in a boardroom, not behind walls of steel and bodyguards, just a young man in an open parking lot on the eve of Mother's Day buying groceries. Within minutes, 15 gunmen would unload more than 500 bullets into his body. A bazooka would be fired. 3 people would die on that asphalt. And the most powerful drug lord in the Western Hemisphere would be left without his favorite son, a son he had groomed since birth to inherit his empire. But here is what nobody talks about. The men who pulled those triggers may not have been enemies at all. They may have been El Chapo's own assassins, his own soldiers, his own people who fired on his son by mistake while hunting someone else entirely. And when they realized what they had done, they said nothing. The story that hit the newspapers blamed the Beltran Leyva brothers, but insiders who were there that night tell a completely different version. And then there is the question of what Édgar was doing in that parking lot in the first place. Because just days before his death, he had traveled to Chicago, defying his father's direct orders to complete a cocaine deal on his own. He came back thinking he had proven himself. He came back thinking that night in Culiacan was just another night. He was wrong. This is the story of the final 24 hours of Édgar Guzmán López. By the end of this video, you will understand why his death did not just break a father, it broke open the bloodiest drug war Mexico had seen in a generation. To understand what happened to Édgar, you first have to understand who he was inside the world of the Sinaloa cartel, and what he represented to the man who ran it. He was born May 30th, 1980-6, in the ranch of Jesus Maria, Sinaloa, the same rugged rural terrain that forged El Chapo himself. His mother was Griselda Lopez Perez, El Chapo's second wife. Édgar was the oldest of their 4 children together. The others, Joaquin Jr., Ovidio, and Griselda Guadalupe, were all younger. But Édgar was the one El Chapo had chosen. Not quietly, not implicitly. Openly, among the people closest to the cartel's inner circle, there was no ambiguity. This boy was supposed to carry the empire forward. In a world where succession in drug trafficking organizations almost always ended in blood, El Chapo's intention to pass his operation down to his own son was an act of faith that went against the statistical reality of their business. It also made Édgar, from the moment he was old enough to carry his father's name in public, one of the most valuable and dangerous people in Sinaloa. People who knew him in Culiacan described someone who did not fit the narco junior stereotype. He was calm, humble even. He attended meetings of the cartel in person, sat at the table with serious men twice his age, and said very little. He listened. He absorbed. His friends forgot sometimes that his last name was Guzmán. Forgot in the way you forget something that is always present. And then the moment it came back to them, everything about the interaction shifted. He was studying business administration. He moved through the city without the theatrical security apparatus that surrounded most of the cartel's upper tier. This was partly practical. The lower your profile, the harder you were to hit. But people close to him said it was also genuinely who he was. Not a performance of humility, just a quiet young man from Sinaloa who happened to be the most protected target in the country. El Chapo kept him out of operations deliberately. He wanted Édgar to finish school first, to understand the world outside the trade before he stepped fully into it. This was not softness, it was calculation. El Chapo had watched what happened to men who entered the business too young, too hungry, before they had the discipline to match their ambition. He was not going to let that happen to the son he planned to hand everything to. But by early 2008, something had shifted in Édgar. He was restless. He had already taken his first concrete step into the business, produced his first gram of cocaine paste, a symbolic threshold that told everyone around him that the waiting was over. He wanted to work. He wanted to prove that the power waiting for him at the end of his father's road was something he had actually earned. And El Chapo, still thinking in terms of years and patience, was moving too slowly for a 21-year-old who had grown up watching his father run the world. At the same time, the world his father controlled was fracturing at its foundation. And that fracture would become the fault line that swallowed Édgar whole. As at January 21st, 2008, Mexican Army Special Forces surrounded a house in Culiacan before dawn. Inside was Alfredo Beltran Leyva, known across the underworld as El Mochomo, the Desert Ant. He was one of 4 brothers who had been El Chapo's most trusted lieutenants for nearly 2 decades. They had come up together. Alfredo had married one of El Chapo's cousins. They called each other family. El Mochomo was arrested that morning so cleanly, so surgically, that it immediately raised questions. He was caught with 2 suitcases stuffed with $900,000 in cash, luxury watches, 20 fragmentation grenades, and 40 bullet-resistant vests. The army moved on him like they had been given a map, because someone had given them a map. Rumors hit the streets of Culiacan within hours. Arturo Beltran Leyva, the oldest and most dangerous of the brothers, known as El Barbas, was told that Joaquin Guzman had handed his own partner over to the government. The motivation, people whispered, was a dispute over drug trafficking routes from the Pacific coast up to Chicago. Alfredo's lifestyle had also been a source of tension. He was flashy, loud, photographed at parties with soap opera actresses and musicians. El Chapo operated in shadows. El Mochomo operated in spotlights, and those spotlights drew attention El Chapo did not want anywhere near his operations. A few months after El Mochomo's arrest, El Chapo's oldest son from his first marriage, Ivan Archivaldo, was released from prison on a legal technicality. To the Beltran Leyva brothers, this was not a coincidence. This was a trade. El Chapo had given them Alfredo in exchange for his other son's freedom. Arturo called a meeting. The alliance known as the Federation, the historic bond between the most powerful narcos in Sinaloa, was declared dead. War was declared. And Arturo Beltran Leyva, the man who had once fought beside El Chapo through everything, announced to anyone who would listen that El Chapo would pay for what he had done. By May 2008, the city of Culiacan was a powder keg. Armed cells from both sides moved through the streets. Assassinations happened in broad daylight. The military had deployed forces to the area, but everyone knew the military only controlled what the cartels allowed them to see. Édgar Guzmán moved through all of it without fully understanding that he had become one of the most valuable targets in Mexico. The days before May 8th began normally, or at least what passed for normal, inside the Guzmán orbit. Édgar had just returned from the United States. He had gone to Chicago with his close friend, Arturo Meza Cazares, the son of Blanca Margarita Cazares Salazar, a powerful figure in the cartel known as La Emperatriz, the Empress. The 2 young men had defied El Chapo's explicit orders not to make the trip. The old man had told his son the risk of arrest was too high. The war with the Beltran Leyva organization had made everyone in the Guzmán family a target, not just in Mexico but on American soil where the cartel's distribution networks were in play. Édgar went anyway. He completed the deal in Chicago. Whatever the transaction was, it went smoothly. He and Arturo flew back to Mexico feeling untouchable, feeling like they had proven something. What Édgar did not know was that a specific operation had been set in motion inside Culiacan. Cartel intelligence had received word that members of the Beltran Leyva organization, possibly Arturo Beltran himself, would be at a commercial plaza in the Desarrollo Urbano Tres Rios neighborhood, one of the wealthiest parts of the city. The plaza sat in the north of Culiacan, anchored by commercial stores, filled with ordinary families on weekends and evenings. A kill order went out. The triggerman assigned to the operation was a Sinaloa cartel enforcer known as El Metrico, a name he earned, allegedly, for how he measured out his cocaine. El Metrico assembled a cell of 15 gunmen, 3 vehicles. They were hunting Arturo Beltran Leyva. They were hunting the man who had declared war on El Chapo. This was supposed to be a decisive strike. That night, Édgar Guzmán arrived at the plaza in an armored Ford Lobo pickup truck, red or appearing red under the dim parking lot lights. He was there with Arturo Meza Cazares and his cousin Cesar Ariel Loera. They had come for groceries. It was the night before Mother's Day. The city was filling up with last-minute shoppers. The parking lot was occupied with ordinary people doing ordinary things. Frida Munoz, Édgar's wife, walked inside the store. She had a daughter with him, also named Frida. Édgar stayed outside, talking with his cousin and his friend. The conversation was casual. No radios, no escorts. El Metrico's reconnaissance had identified a red SUV matching the description of Arturo Beltran Leyva's vehicle. They reported the sighting up the chain of command. Confirmation came back. Take the shot. What happened next unfolded in less than 2 minutes. 3 vehicles converged on the parking lot from different angles. 15 gunmen poured out onto the asphalt. They opened fire simultaneously on Édgar's truck, AK-47s on full automatic, filling the air with a sound the residents of Culiacan would compare to a sustained explosion. 500 bullets, some reports say more, tore through the armored Ford Lobo and through every human being standing near it. A bazooka was fired. The impact tore through the vehicle and left blast damage that spread across the parking lot. Cesar Ariel Loera was killed instantly. Arturo Meza Cazares was killed instantly. Édgar Guzmán López, 22 years old, the chosen heir of the most powerful drug lord in the world, died on the asphalt of a supermarket parking lot, next to a pool of his own blood. The shooters withdrew. 3 late-model vehicles vanished into the Culiacan night. Inside the store, Frida Muñoz heard the gunfire. She would walk out to find her husband dead. She would later identify his body simply by telling police that a group of hitmen had killed him. She offered nothing more. In the world she occupied, saying more than that could get you killed. When El Metrico recognized the bodies, the realization of what had happened fell on him like a wall collapsing. He had not killed Arturo Beltran Leyva. He had killed El Chapo's son. The news moved up the chain in a matter of hours. El Chapo was told. By early the next morning, the streets of Culiacan had gone completely silent. The military withdrew to their barracks because the word had spread. When El Chapo found out, there would be consequences, and nobody wanted to be caught in the open when those consequences arrived. Here is where the story splits into 2 versions, and both of them matter. Understanding why both exist tells you something important about how power operates in the world. El Chapo built. The version that reached the newspapers within days was clean and simple. The Beltran Leyva brothers, furious over El Mochomo's arrest, had ordered the assassination of El Chapo's son as an act of revenge. Arturo Beltran Leyva, El Jefe de Jefes, the boss of bosses, had sent his gunmen to that parking lot to send an unmistakable message. This was the logic of cartel warfare. You cannot reach the man at the top, so you destroy what he loves. This version had the advantage of being entirely plausible. It fit the timeline, it fit the declared war between the 2 organizations. And it assigned blame to an external enemy, which is always the more comfortable story when the alternative is internal failure. The other version came years later from a man named Damaso Lopez Serrano, known in the underworld as El Mini-Leak. He was a close associate of El Chapo's sons, embedded deep in the inner circle of the Chapitos as they built their own power base after their father's capture. In an exclusive interview with journalist Anabel Hernandez, one of Mexico's foremost investigators of organized crime, El Mini-Leak offered a different account. According to him, Sinaloa cartel commanders had planned and coordinated an operation at that commercial plaza based on intelligence suggesting Beltran Leyva members would be present that night. Édgar and his companions walked directly into the middle of that operation. They had no radios, no escorts. They had come to buy groceries. Nobody on the ground identified them in time to stop what had already been set in motion. The third version circulated among people close to the events and reported through multiple cartel monitoring outlets over the years. Places specific blame on El Macho Prieto, Gonzalo Inzunza, the chief enforcer of Ismael El Mayo Zambada, El Chapo's most powerful partner inside the Sinaloa cartel. El Macho Prieto ran lethal operations with a level of aggression that even within the cartel's brutal hierarchy was considered extreme. The theory holds that his cell identified the wrong vehicle in the dark and fired without confirmation. The weaponry recovered from the scene, the specific caliber, the methodology of the attack, was consistent according to sources at the time with El Macho Prieto's operations. 3 explanations. No conviction, no official answer, no one was ever prosecuted. No one inside the cartel ever publicly acknowledged what actually happened. The Mexican government never brought charges related to the specific circumstances of Édgar's death, and El Chapo himself, imprisoned today in a federal penitentiary in the United States, has never spoken about it on record. Whether because he genuinely believes his son was killed by the Beltran Leyvas, or because the alternative truth is something he cannot carry in a way that lets him function, history does not tell us. What is not in dispute is this: Édgar Guzmán López died because the city his father controlled had become so saturated with competing armed cells, so thick with kill orders moving through chains of command and intelligence that was never fully verified, that even the boss's own son was not safe standing in an open parking lot on a Tuesday night. The protection El Chapo had spent his entire career building around his family had a gap in it the size of a red pickup truck in a poorly lit parking lot. And his son fell through it. The funeral would become the most famous in the history of the Sinaloa cartel. El Chapo's grief, by every account that exists, was total. Not the controlled, calculating grief of a man managing optics, something that broke through whatever armor 20 years of cartel leadership had built around him. A grief that was visible even to people who had never seen El Chapo show anything close to vulnerability. He ordered the purchase of every red rose in Culiacan, every single one. Florists across the city reported receiving urgent orders, buyers sent by Guzman's people sweeping through the market, paying whatever was asked, leaving nothing behind. The final count, according to multiple sources, was more than 50,000 roses. The private funeral held in Culiacan was surrounded by floral arrangements so dense they overwhelmed the space. The timing was devastating in its irony. May 10th is Mother's Day in Mexico. The most important flower holiday of the year, women across Culiacan woke up that morning and found the city stripped bare. No roses at the florists, no roses at the markets. Their sons and husbands, the ones who had waited until the last moment, came home with nothing because El Chapo had bought them all for his dead son. Ivan Archivaldo Guzman, Édgar's older half-brother, the man whose release from prison had triggered the chain of events, confirmed the story years later in the only interview he ever gave, published in the Belgian magazine Knack in 2018. The journalist asked him directly whether his father had really done it. Ivan confirmed it without elaboration. Singer Lupillo Rivera turned the story into a corrido called 50,000 Rosas, 50,000 roses. The opening lines translate roughly as 50,000 red roses were sold in Culiacan, arriving on May 10th, ready to celebrate, but just days before Édgar Guzmán was taken from us. The pile of roses was not sent to any mother. They all went to a man who was always respected. Édgar was buried at Panteón Villa Jesus Maria in the municipality of Culiacan. A cenotaph, a memorial monument, was erected at the site of his death, in the parking lot of the commercial plaza where the attack occurred. El Chapo commissioned it personally. It was built in the shape of a cross, and within months it became one of the most visited sites in Culiacan. Not by tourists, by people from the city who had grown up knowing his name, who decorated it with flowers on his birthday, on Dia de Muertos, on Christmas, on New Year's Day. When the government tried to have it removed, arguing it glorified drug trafficking, men appeared in vehicles around the monument, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They said nothing. They did not need to. The monument stayed. The violence that followed Édgar's death rewrote the map of Mexico. In the 3 weeks after May 8th, more than 116 people were murdered in Culiacan alone. 26 of them were police officers. In June, the death toll climbed to over 128. In July, 143, the Mexican federal government deployed 2,000 additional troops to the region. The troops changed nothing. The war had its own momentum now, fed by years of accumulated grievances, betrayals, and blood debts that no amount of military presence was going to resolve. The wave spread beyond Culiacan. The cities of Guamuchil, Guasave, and Mazatlan were pulled into the violence. Roadblocks appeared on highways. Families who had lived in Sinaloa for generations began quietly relocating to other states. Businesses closed early. Schools locked their gates. The ordinary infrastructure of daily life in Culiacan, the kind of life Édgar himself had been living, going to the supermarket the night before Mother's Day, became dangerous in ways it had not been, even by Sinaloa's historically brutal standards. The Beltran Leyva organization, whether they ordered Édgar's death or not, used the moment to consolidate their alliance with Los Zetas, the most feared enforcement arm in the country. They coordinated with the Gulf Cartel. They moved into southern states, Guerrero, Oaxaca, Morelos, establishing corridors El Chapo had not bothered to contest because he never needed to. He was about to need to. The fracture that began with El Mochomo's arrest in January spread into a full structural collapse of the criminal alliance that had dominated Mexican drug trafficking for nearly a decade. Arturo Beltran Leyva, El Barbas, the man who had declared war on El Chapo and who many held responsible for ordering Édgar's death, was killed 18 months later, December 16, 2009. Mexican Marines tracked him to a luxury apartment building in Cuernavaca. The confrontation lasted hours and ended with Arturo shot dead. His brother Hector was arrested in 2014. Alfredo El Mochomo, the man whose arrest had started everything, had already been extradited to the United States, eventually sentenced to life in prison in April 2017, ordered to forfeit $529 million to the federal government. The Beltran-Leyva organization, once the muscle behind the most powerful cartel in the hemisphere, was fractured into competing remnants that scattered across the south and central regions of Mexico. El Chapo himself was captured in January 2016 and extradited to the United States in January 2017. He received a life sentence in July 2019. He is currently held at the ADX Florence Supermax facility in Colorado, the same prison that holds the most dangerous inmates in the American federal system. He has not spoken publicly about his son. The brothers Édgar left behind, the Chapitos, as they became known, went on to lead the Sinaloa cartel after El Chapo's capture. Ivan Archivaldo Joaquin Jr. Ovidio and Jesus Alfredo became the next generation of power in the organization. Their childhoods shaped by exactly the kind of violence that killed their brother. Their rise through the cartel defined by the same dangerous logic that took him from them. Ovidio was arrested in January 2023 in an operation that triggered another explosion of violence through the streets of Culiacan. Gunmen seizing vehicles, blocking roads, engaging soldiers in firefights that were recorded on phones and distributed worldwide. He was extradited to the United States in September of that year. Joaquin was arrested in July 2024 at El Paso, Texas, alongside El Mayo Zambada himself, in a surrender operation whose full circumstances remain bitterly disputed. The Sinaloa cartel, the entity Édgar was supposed to inherit, has not had a moment of peace since the night he died in that parking lot. But here is the detail that stays with you, the one that cuts through all the geopolitics and cartel history and gets down to something human. Édgar had just turned 22. He was weeks away from his birthday. He had returned from Chicago feeling like he had finally proved something. He walked into that parking lot without his radio and without his escorts because he was not thinking like a target that night. He was thinking like a young man buying groceries for his family before a holiday. His wife was inside the store when it happened. She was holding the shopping basket, walking the aisles while everything ended outside. El Chapo, the man who had survived prison escapes, military raids, assassination attempts, betrayals from partners he had known for decades, was not there. Could not be there, was somewhere in the mountains of Sinaloa, invisible to the world, as his most beloved son bled out on concrete 50 feet from a supermarket entrance. There is a version of this story that reads as pure cartel warfare, a power struggle between rival organizations, a tragic casualty in a war between criminals. That version is true. There is another version where a 22-year-old who wanted his father's approval went out one night without his radio and never came home. That version is also true. The most honest telling of this story holds both of those things at once. El Metrico, the man who led the hit squad that night, who recognized the bodies when he walked close enough to see who they were, was reportedly so overcome with what he had done that he could not speak. One source describes him as filled with sadness and regret that he carried for years afterward. Whether that regret was about Édgar specifically, or about what El Chapo would do when he found out, history does not clearly separate. What is clear is that El Metrico never publicly admitted what happened. The official story, Beltran-Leyva retaliation, was easier for everyone. Easier for the men who pulled the triggers. Easier for the commanders who gave the order without confirming the target. Easier for El Chapo perhaps, because believing his son was killed by an enemy is survivable in a way that believing he was killed by friendly fire is not. The corrido that Lupillo Rivera sang captured something real about what Édgar Guzmán López meant to Culiacan. Not the cartel politics, not the succession plan, just a young man, the son of a powerful father, caught inside a war he was only just beginning to understand. The 50,000 roses are the part people remember. They became a legend, then a fact, then a legend again. The kind of story that Sinaloa absorbs into its identity. But the roses were not the story. The roses were El Chapo's way of expressing something he could not say any other way in the world he lived in. A father's grief, measured out in flowers, broadcast to a city that understood exactly what he was doing and why. Every year on May 8th, the cenotaph in that parking lot is covered in arrangements. Red roses, white roses, balloons, bottles of wine, photographs. Men sit in cars nearby and watch. The memorial exists in the middle of an active commercial district, surrounded by stores where ordinary people shop for groceries and clothing and household goods. Every year, life moves around it, and every year, someone shows up with flowers. Édgar Guzmán López was 22 years old. He was 3 weeks from his birthday. He was buying groceries for Mother's Day. He was the son of the most feared man in Mexico, and he died the same way hundreds of other young men died that year in Culiacán. Suddenly, in a parking lot, with 500 bullets and no warning. The final 24 hours of Édgar Guzmán López reveals something uncomfortable about inherited power, that the name that protects you from everything can, under the wrong circumstances, become the reason you are targeted. That the war your father builds can consume the thing he was building it to protect. That the city your family controls can still kill you while you are standing in its most ordinary spaces. El Chapo built an empire. He built it for his sons. And on May 8, 2008, his own empire killed his favorite one. Whether by enemy hands or friendly fire, whether by deliberate strategy or catastrophic mistake, whether history ever fully answers the question or not. The roses came 2 days later. There were no flowers left for any other mother in the city. That was how it ended.